Well, we're so glad to have you guys here.
Are we waiting on anyone? Or are we...
Alan just took a call. I would go ahead and start.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is lesson 7. Can you believe it?
Yeah.
Mindfulness of Feelings, part 3. So today we bring this
All together.
focus on feelings to a close. So I wanted to begin by sharing with you the story of the lotus flower. Have any of you ever seen lotus flowers floating on ponds, right? It's how they grow. But in certain Eastern cultures, the lotus flower is highly revered as a sacred flower because of what it has to teach us about endurance, resilience, and its capacity to really transform our relationship to suffering. So I didn't know until just a few years ago the way that the lotus flower grows in terms of its endurance and its resilience. A lotus flower seed can exist for several hundred years without water and still be planted and come into full growth. So there is resilience in the seed itself. But what's interesting about the lotus is that they're very pristine flowers. And when we see them at full growth, they are floating on top of very muddy, very murky ponds because their roots are rooted into the mud and the muck of the pond. That is what actually feeds and sustains them. The lotus flower opens at the break of dawn. And when it's open and you see it, they're usually pink or white. There is not any sense whatsoever that they've come from the mud. Most lotus flowers actually begin to close as dusk begins to settle in. They close for cellular renewal and regeneration. So they're very wise. You know, they know enough to close, and in some respects, some lotus flowers actually will go back underneath the water. They will submerge again, only to come back out into the light of day the next morning, completely pristine, right? So out of this understanding of the lotus flower came the phrase, no mud, no lotus. And this phrase is most often associated with this beautiful Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. No mud, no lotus. So what does this mean? Okay. My beauty, your beauty, and I don't mean outer beauty, although it can mean this, but my beauty, your beauty truly arises out of the mud and the muck of our experience. When you look back at all of the ways in which you've suffered really, really difficult times, and you see where you are now, most likely you recognize the gifts and the lessons that were inherently part of that suffering. And this is what I mean about the transformation of suffering. How can we look at suffering differently? We know that pain is inevitable. It's inevitable. We cannot be here in existence without the knowledge that we will experience pain. But the suffering is something different. The suffering is something different. And when I say, how can we transform our relationship to suffering? There's a lot to be learned from the lesson of the lotus and that quote, no mud, no lotus. The depth and the richness of my life and the beauty of my life is rooted in the mud and the muck of my own experience. So in really difficult times in my life, one of my mantras, even in the moment of great, great suffering, even when I'm in that moment and I don't quite understand what this all means, is no mud, no lotus. No mud, no lotus. No mud, no lotus. In February, a very dear friend of mine lost her life to metastatic breast cancer. She was only 45, and she's the single mom of 2 tween daughters. And when she was diagnosed initially with breast cancer, which she actually beat, she came to me right at the start of her diagnosis, right before she started having any treatments, and she said, I'm going to have chemotherapy, radiation, I've got a long road ahead of me, but I want to have also some kind of spiritual practice to support me in this. You know, how can I look at this experience in a way I'm not going to be so derailed by it, because I've got these two daughters and I want to ease their suffering. And at the same time, I want to be a role model for them as to how you can navigate really difficult experiences. Now, I want to be clear that this does not mean that she was not curled up in a ball, you know, at certain times during her journey, but she did have these meditation practices to support her. And one of the first things that I talked to her about was this idea of the lotus. Lisa, no mud, no lotus. What will you make this mean for you? Right? So 8 years after her initial diagnosis, when she discovers, after 1.5 years of being cancer-free, that she's got metastatic breast cancer, and there's no cure for that. Right? You can only maintain a certain quality of life for a certain period of time, but there's no cure. We came back to that phrase, no mud, no lotus, and she clung to that. I mean, that was something that was really important to her. What can I make of this experience? The mud and the muck of this experience. And she became a voice for educating about metastatic breast cancer. Prior to knowing her, I didn't know what that meant, what metastatic breast cancer was. I didn't know that breast cancer cells can come into different parts of the body and take root and ultimately, you know, be the cause of your death. I didn't know that. So she became a really strong voice, and a young voice, for this experience, because metastatic breast cancer research is very, very poorly funded, right? So this is what she made of the mud and the muck of her experience. How did it contribute to her beauty as a person? With everything that she was going through, she never, ever forgot in a moment with anyone that she was with to look at you and say, how are you doing? What's going on with you and your kids? What's going on with you and your life? She was never absent of that awareness of, this is what my situation is. I am not going to fight against what is. I'm going to search for the ways in which to make it meaningful. And I'm also going to maintain very strongly my connection to others. So I visited her in the final days of her death up at the hospice on the up in Scranton, the Dunmore area. Beautiful hospice, and she was losing her mind. You know, the cancer had spread to her mind, but she had a couple of moments of lucidity when I was there, and she looked radiant. She just looked radiant. And one of the last things that she said to me, because that was the last time that I saw her, was, Christine, no mud, no lotus. Right? And I'll never forget that. She was a living, breathing expression of the special meaning of the lotus flower and what it has to teach us about resilience, about endurance, and about how we can transform the nature of our suffering. So I wanted to open by sharing this with you because it links into the two major topics for today's lesson. One is a beautiful acronym that we call RAIN, that you can use whenever you need to meet a difficult situation, a difficult emotional situation, a difficult person, a difficult event that's occurring, right? And then we're going to end our time here today talking about metta, loving kindness, and how we can move ourselves through the experience of a loving kindness meditation. We're going to do it in a very formal way. And then I'll invite you to sort of create your own version of metta practice, because when you practice metta on a regular basis, you not only discover a much greater capacity for both empathy and compassion for others, even people that you really struggle to have empathy and compassion for. But I think for me, the most important benefit of regular metta practice is the kind of self-compassion that I've cultivated for me, which has been really, really important. And those two things are interdependently linked. The degree to which you're kinder to yourself spills over into your capacity to be kind to others. Right? And then that in turn feeds nurturing, tender kindness towards self. All right, so this is a nice way to bring this journey that we've taken so far in exploring mindfulness of feelings. So before we begin, I want to share a meditation practice that you can use as your formal practice, because we can start now to, at this phase of our journey, we can start creating a formal practice that really works for us. And for a long time, my practice was no mud, no lotus. And that is using an image, that's why I brought this, using an image of the lotus flower in my mind as my anchor. So we're going to do that today just for about 3 to 5 minutes. And as we're in this meditation practice, I'm just going to speak a little bit. And as I'm speaking and you're listening, just let whatever arises arise. But what I'll be speaking about is it actually creates a contemplative experience or a reflective experience where you get to think about your own mud, the mud that you've trudged through, the mud that's coming, right? And the beauty that's emerged from that, and the beauty that will continue to emerge from that, okay? So as we're going through this, just, sort of ask yourself, is this a practice that I might implement, maybe once or twice per week, a reflection on the lotus, okay? All right. So is the radio on?
Yes, I turned up the show.
It's yours, not the show, it's mine.
So we don't have that sound coming in.
Okay. So let's come into that comfortable seated position, whatever works for you. At this point, you know what works for you or what's been working for you.
Life is happening.
Life is happening, yes. So preferably, we've got these feet about hip width apart. Always remembering that we can use these feet to anchor us into this moment, just feeling the sensation of the feet against the floor. Perhaps your hands are resting on your thighs or gently in your lap. The spine is long and tall, dignified, yet relaxed. Shoulders are down and back, creating that spaciousness in the chest and the heart. Eyes and the jaw relax. And just for a few moments, taking your awareness to the breath. And today we're going to just allow the exhalation to be slightly longer than the inhalation. So just noticing the inhalation, and as you exhale, just draw it out a little bit longer. Just knowing that when we do that, we start to deactivate the central nervous system. taking it out of alarm mode. And as such, the mind starts to settle. And now perhaps bringing to your mind an image of the lotus. Floating so elegantly on top of the calm waters of the pond. Knowing that its beauty is rooted in and nourished by the mud below. And just perhaps for a moment, imagining that your life, your entire life, is expressed in that lotus. And can you see that the gifts and the lessons, of your life thus far are rooted in the mud and the muck? Feeling your heart soften. Can you feel the degree to which your heart opened ever wider to love and compassion each time it seemed that it was breaking? Do you see the wisdom expressed as radiance in your own eyes? Knowing that that wisdom came from moving through the difficult things. Do you know that the degree of suffering you felt when you've lost is equal to how deeply you loved? Can you see within the context of your own life that without the mud, there would be no lotus? No mud, no lotus. Let us not fear our suffering or the depth and the complexity of our feelings. Let us not fear the awe and the ecstasy of love, or the heavy sobs that accompany loss. Let us feel the joy and the wonder and even the weight of disappointment. Let us embrace the mud and the flower. Just very gently dropping out of the practice, taking a few moments to just settle into the quiet. Whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. Everybody feel good? So again, consider using this image as an anchor in your formal practice. And just remember that phrase, no mud, no lotus. It's actually pretty pronounced in the email that supports this lesson. And there's a link if you want to know more about this. It's referred to as an aquatic perennial. If you want to know more about how it grows, just reading about how it grows and how it sustains itself, you can derive your own lessons from that. You know, it's just a very, very meaningful flower lesson from nature. So no mud, no lotus is a wonderful thing to keep in your back pocket whenever you feel like you're on the verge of being engulfed or ensnarled by emotion or feelings. And what we're really aiming to get to here is for the possibility to exist that we could change the way that we think about things, or that we could train our minds out of our tendency toward reactivity and into more frequent states of responsiveness. There's a big difference. And it's really important to know that as human beings, we come in hardwired toward reactivity because we must. You know, it's interesting. I read recently that there are only 2 things that a newborn baby fears. Does anyone know what they are? There's only 2 things that newborns fear. They fear being dropped, and they fear loud noises. So imagine that we come in just fearing these 2 things, because infants do have some sense of perception in terms of depth, right? So they understand that at some level, they're aware instinctively that if I'm dropped, there's going to be trouble. And loud sound really startles them. But in the face of being dropped and loud sounds, you will see an infant react just like we do. Our tendency to react comes from the oldest part of the brain, the reptilian brain. Our tendency to react as a default mode is all about a really strong instinct within all of us to survive. We just want to survive. But what makes us different from cave people, who mostly operated out of that part of the brain, is that most of the time, we don't wake up in danger. When you think about living back then, we wake up and one of the first things, likely, that we thought about was, am I safe? Is my family safe? And what do I need to do today to make sure that we have continued shelter, that we're not going to be attacked by wild animals, and that we have food? Total survival. They're not thinking about can I take my next self-help seminar? I'm really dying to read. I need to write a letter, right? This is a total survival. And we still have that within us. And it lives in us as this almond-shaped part of the brain called the amygdala, which is our alarm system. It tells us when we are in danger. So when I wake up in the middle of the night and my fire alarm is going off, I can kick into action and save myself and my family. I can fight off an intruder. I can run from a burning home. I can freeze or shut down when I need to. Just like animals in the wild, like the opossum plays dead to stay safe. So when we talk about the stress response, we know it to be three things for sure. We fight, we flee, we freeze. But we also do something else. It's known as the fourth F. It's called fawning. All of the things we do to fawn over others or to please others so that we can survive. And then the fifth F that people like Dan Siegel are talking about now, and he's got this really, I think I actually have a link somewhere along the line, there was a link to his work in terms of neuroscience and children and stress, is he talks about the fifth F, which he talks about fainting. And it's not necessarily physical fainting, although the body will faint when it's in high levels of stress that we are unable to manage or cope with. But children have their own version of fainting. It is a total emotional shutdown. But this is the stress response, and we're grateful for the stress response because it does help us to survive when we are in true danger. Most of the time, we are not in true danger. So I was leading a workshop about this the other day, and I said to the participants, think about what your first thought was upon rising today. Your very first thought when you opened your eyes. And most of them said their very first thought was, oh shit. And then it's everything that I have to do today, or I didn't get enough sleep, or in other words, and they were totally right. No one answered in the wrong way. And the way that they responded hints to what's known as our negativity bias. Just like we are hardwired into survival, we're also hardwiring to look for the problem. We are hardwired into negative thinking. We are hardwired into look for all the ways that we're not safe and what we're going to do about that. It's just how we're structured. And the pathways in the brain, the neural pathways in the brain at our age are so deep and so firmly entrenched toward the negativity bias and survivalism that we often wonder, is it hopeless to try to change that? But what we also know about the brain is that it's plastic, it's malleable, and we can change those neural pathways. And this is one of the most powerful ways to do that. How can I think differently about the things that I face? You know, when I think about the fact that I know it is true that pain will occur, that everything changes, and that I will inevitably be confronted by something that feels stressful to me every day, multiple times per day. And we talk about, or we use the word stress management. How am I going to manage the stress I'm confronted with? I like to use the word meet over manage. Think about the power of language and how that impacts how we think about things. When I think about managing something, I'm thinking about how am I going to control this? How am I going to wrangle with this? How am I going to get a grip over what it is that is causing me stress? Versus, how am I going to meet the inevitable? When you think about meeting someone, when I meet someone for the first time, there is a leaning in to the other person. There is a softness. When I'm thinking about managing, right, there is a sense of control, a sense of resistance. I've got to get a hold over this. So I prefer to use the word, how am I going to meet difficult feelings, difficult situations, difficult people, as opposed to how am I going to manage them? When I use the word meet, that puts me into more of a responsive state as opposed to a reactive state. So one exercise that you can do on your own is to start thinking about what things, people, feelings really trigger me into high reactivity. Like when you think about the things that have you totally go off the handle really quickly, because when you're reactive, there is no space between the trigger and whatever it is that you decide to do, or whatever it is that you do. I won't even say decide, because there's little choice in reactivity. It's like a nuclear reactor. We know that a nuclear reactor will blow when a button is pushed. There is no space or time between the button being pushed and an explosion or as some sort of destruction, right? It's not like you can push the button and say, I'm taking that back. Okay, you've pushed the button. It's like people in your life who push your buttons and suddenly you've just blown up. Or your reaction is something you regret later. So most of us desire a more responsive state so that we're not in situations where we're thinking, I wish I could have handled that better. Or I don't want to feel so controlled by my emotions. I don't want to feel so triggered by these circumstances. Because when I'm controlled by my feelings, when I'm controlled by another person, when I'm controlled by my triggers, I am not free. And if I could say one thing about these practices, when practiced regularly, they help you to see all the ways in which you're really free. You just didn't know it. It's like sitting in a jail cell, looking at the bars ahead of you, wondering, when am I going to get out of this? I don't want to be here anymore. And you look down into your lap and you see that all along you've been holding the key. And these practices are the key. So Viktor Frankl wrote this incredible book called Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, a very renowned psychiatrist when he was taken into captivity, along with his wife and children, brothers, sisters, parents, all of whom died during the Holocaust. And he was aware of their deaths while he was imprisoned. And it was interesting because he studied trauma. In fact, he had just finished writing a book about trauma. And it was his dream to have that book published. And he was very close to that before he was taken into captivity. And so his whole thing while he was there is, how am I going to survive this? Really, no mud, no lotus. I am in these horrific, indescribable living condition, being mentally and physically abused, face to face with my captors every day, how am I going to survive this? Because he could see the people around him. He could see that the mental and emotional toll that this was taking was far greater than the physical atrocities that they suffered. And he decided, or he came to understand, that you can take away my family, you can take away my book manuscript, you can attempt to dismantle all the things that I've accomplished and done, but there is one thing that you cannot take from me. And you cannot take from me my power to respond to this suffering as opposed to react to it. And he has this incredible line that we hear very often in mindfulness trainings. And the quote is, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And within that space resides my power to choose. My power to choose. And therein lies my freedom. So I can be jailed, I can be tortured, I can be held captive. But between all that stimulus and how I respond to it, there's this space, and I get to choose what my response is going to be. And therein lies my freedom. So I benefit as a human being from his experience in this knowledge that it doesn't matter what the trigger is. It doesn't matter who you are or what the situation is. But when I start to feel those physical sensations, those thoughts that tell me, you know what, Christine, you're like real close to being on the ledge here. You're really close to blowing it. I remember, oh, there's a space here. There is a space here where I can take a pause and I can make a decision about how I'm going to respond. Most of us don't realize that the space exists. We don't realize that we have the right to claim a place in that space. We are triggered and we react. And most of the time when we react, unless we're in true danger and we truly have to save our life, it doesn't turn out very well. When you think about the times in your life where you were highly reactive, when you were triggered, it likely did not turn out very well. So when I take the time, and it need not be a lot of time because sometimes we don't have a lot of time. I can't say to someone when I'm being triggered, I'm sorry. I need to go stand in my space before I come back and respond. We don't always have that time. And sometimes we do. And one strategy you can utilize is to be brutally honest with others. Hey, I need you to know that I'm getting really triggered right now. And so I'm going to go and take a pause. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to respond because you deserve my response, not my reaction. And I deserve to respond because reactivity hurts me the most. The charge, the overwhelm, the cortisol and the adrenaline of being a highly reactive person hurts me. It will impact my longevity. It will impact my physical and my mental and emotional well-being. So I do it first for myself, and then I do it for you. Could you imagine? You're probably thinking of people in your life who should be hearing this that are highly reactive, and you're probably thinking, what would it be like? How would it feel to me if that person said, you know what, there's something I've been working on, and I've been working on being less reactive, and I need a pause here. What a gift that would be for you, right? So I always recommend that when you have this insight, that you start incorporating it into relationships that really matter to you. Because when you begin to be more responsive, you really do enjoy freedom. I remember the moment I decided, this wasn't that long ago, by the way, it was about 3 years ago, I decided, I'm just giving up judgment. I'm giving up judgment. And I made this decision because I realized every time my sister called me, it was always about some crisis. And it got me reactive, and then I'd be right into the whole drama of it all, and I'd get off the call and I would think to myself, she's the first person I talk to almost every day. This is not a good, this is like totally out of alignment with how I'm aiming to live. But I also knew that I'm not going to change her reactive spirit right now. And I said, I'm going to drop judgment. And I always knew, I've told people there's a lot of freedom in dropping judgment, but I never really fully did it authentically. And when I made that decision, everything changed for me. Do you know how freeing it is to be able to sit with someone when they're in their drama and all their stuff, and you don't judge it and you just hear it? And it doesn't dismantle you. You know, that's coming into a responsive, not only frame of mind, but a responsive way of being. Okay. So, no mud, no lotus, just as a mantra, no mud, no lotus, when I'm in the thick of the muck of it all, I remember it. It brings me into a responsive frame of mind. In the moment of being triggered, I retreat. I pull back emotionally, mentally, sometimes physically. I pull back, I retreat. I find a way to regroup myself. And then I come back and respond. This is known as the 3 R's: retreat, regroup, respond. These are just some tools that you can utilize. No mud, no lotus, retreat, regroup, respond. Remembering that Viktor Frankl quote, between being that stimulus, that trigger, and whatever it is I decide I'm going to do, there's that space. And the freedom is always remembering, wait a minute, I get to choose. My feelings don't get to choose. This person doesn't get to choose. I get to choose. And another tool to utilize and to think about is this notion of needing. And I'll end here before we move forward into rain. The notion of needing. If you use that word, think about it. Think about the difference between management and needing. Because all we have is moment to moment to moment to moment. I just spoke about a moment, it's already gone. It's all I have. The moment that is before me, and I get to decide what version of myself I'm going to bring to that. Because there's lots of versions of me. And I don't suffer from multiple personality disorder, but there are lots of versions, right? I love this blog. It's called Scary Mommy. And it's this woman who writes very bluntly about the trials and tribulations of motherhood and the times when she becomes, the kids are like, you're scary mommy right now. That's one version of herself. Now, scary mommy is reactive mommy, which is very different from responsive mommy, right? So in this moment, whatever it is, I get to decide what version of myself I'm going to bring forth. And that's a very powerful understanding. And I love that because I get to try on different ways of being. It doesn't mean that I'm not authentic, but it does mean that I've got this decision that I get to make that grows out of the awareness. And this is where mindfulness of feelings began, in awareness. None of this is possible unless you are first aware, I'm getting triggered. And then responsiveness. How am I going to meet this moment? And there are plenty of times when I blow it. And there are plenty of times when I ask the question, what version of Christine is going to meet this moment? And I decide the shitty one, or the angry one, or the crazy, scary one. But at least I know that I made a decision. And I'm not sleepwalking through my life as a human reactor. And you will start to notice, even after this session, and just this small bit on reactivity versus responsiveness, the people in your life who are reactive, that don't have any sense whatsoever that they have the power to choose. And think about Viktor Frankl. Therein lies my freedom, in the worst of circumstances. The acronym RAIN, R-A-I-N, is most often associated with the work of a beautiful, powerful meditation teacher, Tara Brach. Although she didn't coin the acronym, she has brought it into, it's really a therapeutic tool, she brought it into the mindfulness world. And RAIN is pretty similar to the 6-step process that I brought you through during lesson 5, in just sort of cultivating an awareness of feelings. But RAIN, if you move through it, once you're exposed to what it all means, if you move through it during a difficult situation, if you practice it enough, you're going to notice that you will get to N much more quickly. So it's something that you have to sort of work with and practice. It's really easy. And in your support email, there's a link to Tara Brach guiding you through a meditation using RAIN. So you can listen to that over and over again until it becomes, again, part of your being, okay? Recognize, and that's about awareness. And let's work with the notion of trigger. I recognize in this moment that I'm getting triggered. So start thinking about not only what triggers me, who triggers me, and how the trigger feels, but what physical sensations, because your body is going to be the first, it's the truth teller, the first communicator of, oh boy, triggering is starting to occur. Right? So I recognize that I'm being triggered because I feel a certain way physically, and I'm starting to think a certain way. And mostly I'm getting ready to pounce, or I'm getting ready to fight, or I'm triggered and I'm getting ready to leave this room and run away. Or I'm triggered and I'm getting ready to just totally shut down and go into freeze mode. So recognition, number 1. A, allow and accept that this is what's happening. Like my friend, Lisa, RAIN worked for her as an acronym that guided her through her cancer journey. I recognize I've got metastatic breast cancer. I've got physical manifestations of that. It's hard not to see that. Allow and accept. So the A, you can use the word allow or accept, but allow and accept means I'm not in resistance to this. No, this is not what I would have chosen for my life. But when I allow and accept it, I create a space for it. Because what do we do mostly when bad things are happening or uncomfortable things are happening? We resist, or we allow it to completely overwhelm us. So the allowance and the acceptance, I used the analogy of the visitor before when it comes to feelings. I allow and I accept that this is what is so, that it is not always going to feel the way that it feels, because we know from our experience that nothing we're feeling is permanent, nor is any experience we're having permanent. When I allow and accept it, I can be at peace with it. I might not like it, but I can be at peace with it. We've talked about the I piece before, R-A-I, investigate what is there with a lot of kindness. The investigation of what is there. Wow, I'm feeling really scared about the future of my daughters. You know, what does that fear feel like? What does that fear mean? How can I meet that fear in a way that's really healthy for them? Does anyone know what the investigative piece does or why it works? in mindfulness. If I'm really, there's something really big going on, I recognize it, I allow and I accept, and then I kind of, investigate it with curiosity. It creates a space between me and it so that I don't become my anger. It doesn't become all consuming, or I don't become my fear or my grieving. That's another form of freedom. Like, wow, this fear is so big in me. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it mean? What is it trying to tell me? What choices do I have to respond to it? When you're an investigator on a you're doing an investigation of something, the investigator has a distance. So the investigator can really see what's actually going on. So when I investigate something like anger, for example, and I shared this with you, I think last time or maybe the time before, when I really look at anger curiously, with a curiosity, I see, under this anger, there could be fear, a sense of being hopeless, or a lot of hurt. And almost every time when you're angry, if you step back and say, oh, in what way am I hurt, feeling helpless, or really afraid? You will find one, two, or all of those things. And if all three are present, you're really angry. It's almost can show up as rage. But wow, just that knowing, like my relationship to anger is completely different because I always am able to say, okay, step back, be curious, hurt, helpless, afraid. Mostly we're all three. It's really much easier to show up as enraged than it is to say, I'm terrified, you hurt me, or I feel so helpless and out of control. Because those statements require a lot of vulnerability. Anger, I'm just ready to go, ready to fight, ready to pounce. Right? And in the end can be two things. Whatever resonates most with you, the end can be, I recognize what's happening, I accept, I allow it to be here. I'm kind of investigating it. I'm not attaching myself to it. I'm not attaching myself to it. It is not going to become me. I am not going to become it. So again, that's that distance. So see how that feels for you, or nurturing awareness, meaning I recognize what's happening. I'm aware, I allow it, I'm accepting, I'm investigating with curiosity, and I'm holding it in a nurturing way. This is what it is. I'm, with everything that I know and everything that I practice, it's helped me a lot when I'm really pissed off to not go to, you can't be pissed off. You teach meditation. Or who are, to go that route, which is what we do. We're very judgmental about ourselves and our feelings, and of others. But nurturing awareness means it's sort of like, a very young child, and children are only reactive. They don't know how to be responsive yet. It's a cultivated skill, being responsive. It's a cultivated skill. We would not batter a child for expressing anger or fear, especially fear. We would hold them very tenderly because we honor their humanity. We're like, this is what it means to be a human being. You can be angry and sad and joyful and elated all in the span of 5 minutes. We don't judge a child for that. So the end part, not attaching to that. I'm not going to become that. That is not me. Or nurturing awareness, or a little bit of both. So do you see, or can you imagine, if you work through rain enough, something happens, you go RAIN, quick, like within a span of just a couple of seconds, minutes. Eventually, something happens and you're going to go straight to N, not attaching to that, just holding that with nurturing awareness. And when that starts to happen, you really feel free. You can be out in the world, navigating through the world, really feeling safe in your own home, your own inner home. And that's really where all of these practices are taking us. They're taking us back here, back to my mind, back to my heart, and back to an awareness and an understanding that I have enormous amounts of choice here in terms of how I'm going to meet this really difficult feeling, person, moment, situation. Okay, does that make sense? All right, quiz. R. Recognize. A. I. Investigate. But you don't want to be the investigator that's in there saying, I can't believe what I'm discovering here. This is so disappointing. The investigator is more like, it's really the curiosity of a child. Like, wow, like, I never realized that we are sort of held in these mountains. That's what a valley is, right? Like that kind of like, wow, curiosity. So investigate with curiosity and kindness. N, non-attachment. Nurturing awareness. Yeah. A lot of people struggle with the N, so I hope that was clear. I'd like to give examples to make that clear, because when you just read about it, people don't understand what non-attachment means, or nurturing awareness. Like, what is that? That sounds good, but I don't know what it means. But you know enough now to really know what those things mean. So finally, going back to, I have a moment here. So I do want to share something with you related to triggers. Does anyone in here know, like, can you think of something right away that just gets you every time? A person or a situation that just triggers you so that you're almost left every time reflecting back thinking, oh, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I did that. Mm-hmm. Can you share? Would you like to share?
I was thinking this weekend I was pumping gas, and a guy got out of his car smoking a cigarette and threw it on the ground. And I'm thinking, really? Like, A, somebody's going to have to go out and pick that up. B, you're at a gas station.
Yeah.
I mean, and to the point where I was like going to go say something to him, and then I'm like, no, he's probably got a gal in the car.
Oh,
yeah.
And there are certain things, so there can be isolated incidents that trigger us, right? And there can also be incidents that tend to be more patterned. Accuse me, imply, suggest that I am a bad mother. That's a big trigger. But I'm aware of that. So when something like that happens, so there can be these themes in our lives, right? But I think this is really helpful. Speaking of triggers, a neuroscientist came up with what he calls the SCARF model. Again, it's an acronym, SCARF. And he said that most human beings are triggered by one or more of the following, so that when you're triggered, you can lean back into the SCARF model and kind of go through it, and you'll have a sense of why you're triggered. So S stands for status. Whenever my status or my role or my identity is threatened, that puts me in a position to potentially go nuclear, be really reactive. So think about times in your life, professionally and personally, when your role or your status within the pack, this really harkens back to pack-like behavior of our ancestors, where everyone needed to know where they stood in the pack and what their role was. So whenever my role or my positioning in the pack, or there's this sense that I'm on the periphery of the pack when once I really belonged, that it creates high arousal of threat within us. So when you're having a moment of being triggered, you can ask yourself, in what way right now is my status here, my role here, being threatened? C, certainty. When our certainty is threatened, because certainty is related for most of us to our security and to our safety, we can find ourselves going nuclear. Okay, so that's the S part of that model. A is autonomy and our independence. I was watching my 8-month-old nephew last night. He's like crawling now. So that's a whole new world. He just started crawling last week. I told my sister-in-law, buckle in, because there's no stopping him, right? And he doesn't know danger, but he gets mad when his autonomy and independence is threatened, when there's a gate in the way. You know, we've got all these things set up, right, to keep him safe, but he doesn't understand that. But you can see in small children, try to raise a puppy and see what you're working against in terms of our innate need for autonomy. When that is threatened in our grown-up lives, look out, I will beat you up, right? I will want to run out of the room. I will want to leave this marriage. I will want to, think of all the things I will shut down. High threat response when our autonomy is threatened. So SCAR, connected just as much as we value our autonomy and our independence. Just as much we value our capacity for relatedness. Threaten my relationship. Threaten my ability to be closely connected to others, whether it's a physical threat, a psychological threat, some sort of event occurs that threatens relatedness, that will put me potentially into a highly reactive state. So that's the R. And then the F is fairness. And this is more of a higher order need. This sort of comes about as the brain begins to develop, this notion of what is fair and what's not fair. And we all have different ideas about fairness, but think about when you get really triggered and enraged when you think that something is not fair, when you're not being treated fairly, when others are not being treated fairly, when there are things going on the planet that you think are not fair to human beings, we can get really riled up. Now, there is nothing wrong at all. It makes perfect sense in this model that as a human being, I would get triggered. I would feel threatened whenever I'm questioning status, whenever my certainty, my stability, my autonomy, my relatedness, my sense of fairness and justice is being challenged. That's perfectly fine. That's normal. The question becomes, if I know that these things have the potential to put me into reactivity, what's the alternative if I want to be responsive in a moment where I'm afraid about my status and role being challenged, in a moment where I'm worried about my autonomy? Right? Rather than going cave person in the moment, what choices can I make to meet that moment of that threat in a way that is responsive? So it's a really terrific acronym to remember for 2 reasons. When you feel you're really triggered, even with everything that you know and everything that you're practicing, to run yourself through SCARF, SCARF. And it's also helpful when someone is in front of you really triggered. And again, you can kind of step away and mentally just step away and observe them with curiosity and say, I wonder if their sense of connection and relatedness feels threatened right now. This is so important in leadership. You know, it's one of the things that makes an emotionally intelligent leader is the ability in the moment of having an employee freak out, the ability not to come back with an equal amount of freak out or defensiveness or dominance, but rather the capacity to be in that moment holding this understanding that there's something beneath this. And if I could respond to that, it's a much better way to lead. We can actually get somewhere. Okay. The SCARF model is not in your notes, but if you'd like that, I can send that along, because again, it's really powerful, and it comes out of neuroscience, and it's really about what parts of the brain get really triggered into this cave person mentality, this reptilian mentality, when we're really triggered. Okay. So finally, let's talk a little bit about metta, right? M-E-T-T-A. So loosely translated, the word metta means loving kindness. And it's linked to a whole set of practices that we refer to as the heart or the compassion practices. And they're really lovely. And as I go through metta today, I want you to know that you can use this as well. I try to do a metta practice at least once per week in my own formal sitting time. And sometimes more. There have been periods of time in my life where it was my sole practice because I really needed it. So in a formal metta practice, the practice is usually comprised of 5 different phrases where you are sending the energy and the good wishes and the hope for loving kindness to yourself, to others, and to the world. So I want to give you an example. If you were to Google metta meditation, loving kindness meditation, and you wanted a sense of what the formal terminology is, you could read through the 5 formal phrases and you could say, they work for me or they don't work for me. But I want to share mine with you. And mine are close to the formal phrases, but these are the ones that work for me, and these weren't the ones I used 5 years ago. I'm always changing them, but I want you to think about 2 things. I want you to think about what matters to you. What matters to you right now in your life? To you. And what matters to you in terms of others? Because those can be 2 very different things. In my life right now, what matters is being safe. So my first metta phrase is, may I be safe. May I be happy. May I be well. May I know the experience of peace and ease and grace. And may I awaken to the light of my true nature. Now, what does that mean? Right? May I awaken to the light of my true nature. What that means for me is, may I wake up. May I stay awake to this idea that I am not my name, I am not my role, I am not my degrees, I am not my certifications, I am not my work. That when we strip it all away, there is something fundamentally pure and authentic about me, my essence. You know, it's that part of who you are that remains after the body dies. right? It's essence. All this other stuff, all the other, it's like what's there after all the BS is stripped away. Okay? So that's what I mean by that. So may I wake up to that, because when I'm awake to that, I don't suffer as much. But those are the things that matter to me. Safety, happiness, wellness, peace, ease, grace, and waking up. And so these are also the things that matter to me for others right now. So my phrases might change. They might change next week. They might change in 5 years. So the metta practice unfolds this way. Come into my formal practice, and the first thing I do, in my mind, I hear those phrases, and I direct the energy of loving kindness toward me first. Guess what? This is the hardest part of this practice. Why? Anyone know why?
You're your harshest critic.
We are brutal with on ourselves. We are so brutal. So when I do loving kindness with people, they're like, I hated that part. I checked out during that part. I fell asleep during that part. I just didn't really get into it at all. I just went through it like I was in church saying the prayers. I wasn't connected at all. Stage 2 is you bring to mind someone you just love. It's so easy to love, right? That's the easy part. Yes, may you be happy. May you be at ease. And you focus on that person and you direct the phrases, right? Step 3, bring to mind an acquaintance. Someone you sort of feel neutral about. Just allow that image of that person to come up and direct your phrases in their direction. And then, some people think this is the hard part. Actually, the first part's the hardest, but the fourth part is bring to mind someone with whom you have difficulty. Bring to mind someone that perhaps has hurt you, injured you, someone who has caused harm, someone that you've really been struggling to forgive. And when I get to that part, I use the word even. Say, may you, even you, be safe. May you, even you, be happy. And I just let it be what it is, right? If I'm doing my metta practice and there's all this stuff coming up like, I don't mean that. How could I possibly? Just let it come up, allow it, right? And then the final part, and this is a really beautiful part of the practice, you just bring to mind an image of the planet. And sometimes I just imagine myself kind of looking down on the planet. Or a more contemporary version of this is you can bring to mind an image of a place on this planet where you know there's a lot of suffering. And your words are, may all living beings be safe. May all living beings be happy. Well, may all living beings know the experience of peace and ease and grace. May all living beings awaken to the light of their true nature. And depending on the person or the group or the situation, sometimes I'll add a 6th level and just bring it back to the self. So you get a second chance at self-kindness, but it's really up to you. So this is a version of what we would traditionally find if we were practicing metta, but I think it's really important that you know that you can choose words and phrases that really work for you. Furthermore, the words and the phrases are not as important as how you feel as you're conveying the sentiment of loving kindness. So for example, may I be safe. Before rushing into the other phrases, I want to really give myself a moment to feel what that means. What does it mean to feel safe? May I be happy? And just kind of stay there. Don't worry about, this should not be, I'm thinking about being raised Catholic in church, the rote nature at which we learned our prayers, and I never really knew as a kid, what the hell am I saying here? What does this even mean? Don't make it this rote sort of thing. And sometimes you don't have to have 5 phrases. Maybe you just have 2. Maybe you just work with 1. And and then when you bring to mind someone you really love, may you be safe. Really thinking, like feeling that. What does that mean? What does it mean to send that wish or that sentiment to someone that is the last person on the planet you ever thought you would send that wish to? And when you think about something like safety in terms of the planet and all living beings on the planet, including animals, and that just brings that notion of safety. So what happens is we start very micro. We start with what's closest to us. And then we expand the picture. The word that I love, and that means the most to me when it comes to metta practices, is the word benevolence. I'm very much in love with that word, benevolence. What does it mean to meet a moment, another human being, with the spirit of benevolence, where you look upon them with, benevolence is different than love, although love is part of benevolence, but such a softness of spirit. And you can play with metta practices in your own life. You don't have to be seated in your chair or your cushion. You can go to Wegmans on the eve before Thanksgiving. Really, go to Wegmans and walk around and notice the energy that's there and decide, I'm going to be here in the spirit of loving kindness and benevolence. And every person that you meet, look them in the eyes and look upon them with the eyes of benevolence and loving kindness. And at first they'll look at you like, and then you begin to see something happen. You don't even have to say anything. So when I say that when you practice metta, you're extending the energy of loving kindness, it really is an energy. And again, it is a choice that you make for how you're going to show up in the world. I feel much happier, and my own personal suffering is reduced no matter what's going on in my life when I run around from that place of benevolence and loving kindness. So the practice itself, although part 1 of it can be very difficult for you because you're sort of focusing that energy, directing it toward yourself, when you practice it consistently, it becomes much easier. And it just starts to, you yourself can begin to change the energy of the places and the spaces that you occupy. And this is what we mean when your mindfulness becomes embodied. It's not just something that you do once a day for 6 to 9 minutes, but it actually becomes a way of being, a way of living, a way of it showing up. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about the metta practice? Did you want to add anything? Your own experience with?
The only thing I would add is, for me personally, metta felt really phony when I started practicing it. And I just felt as though I was just going through the motions of it. And many people have that experience, but it's okay. it still works. And so, you know, the teachings are to do it anyway. So it's really important to use the suggestions that Christine recommended, which is, okay, recognize that you feel that way and let it be so. Even the phoniness, right? It may not feel authentic right away. Where I connected most to metta in my practice is when, because for me, that first part of sending compassion, sending loving kindness towards myself felt really uncomfortable. And so my teacher suggested placing that person that's really easy to love in that first place, right? So if you're really struggling with it, just acknowledge this doesn't feel okay to me. And then replace yourself temporarily, okay? Just temporarily. And for a while it was my dog, right? So you don't necessarily have to use a human being there, somebody that's really easy to love, a child, a grandparent. That being doesn't have to be in their human form, right?
Or even here for that
Or
matter.
or
Yeah.
right? So we can really be creative with it. And when it really started working for me is when one of my teachers calls it gorilla metta, right? Where you're just out in the world and you are confronted with suffering. And when we're open and we're living in full presence, you do notice it more, right? You notice the people just walking down Market Street Bridge, right? And they're clearly suffering, whether it's physical suffering, mental or emotional suffering, we know. And so when we're confronted with suffering, just pausing and sending them a metta phrase from your heart. And it does feel authentic, right? So it's often much easier to connect with these practices in those moments. I was in Mexico a few weeks ago, and my son is doing this ocean cleanup project, right? So I'm really aware, like it's all he talks about is plastics in the ocean cleanup. And we were out for a snorkeling trip in the ocean. It's so beautiful. And I just practiced my metta practice right on the boat, looking at the water, sending healing, loving kindness phrases to the ocean, to all the beings that live in the ocean, to all the people that are working so hard to clean up the water, right? And raise awareness to the problem that we're having. So you could be, that's when you'll connect with it most. But at first, it's just gonna feel uncomfortable to some of you, right? And so just let that be so and do it anyway. And it could take a long time.
Does anyone know, when you think about the sort of the trajectory of the 5 stages, why number 4, you know, in stage 4, was that when we get to that person, the difficulty, why is that person in number 4? It would be very difficult to start with that person. So it's almost like we're priming ourselves to get to that place, and more so than to get to the vastness, you know, of the planet when we get to the final place, which is sometimes why coming back kind of full circle and coming back to self and giving one more round to self can be really powerful, because then you've really worked with. But I really just started thinking recently about giving myself more time with my phrases to make sure that I'm connecting to how these things feel: safety, happiness, being well, peace, true nature. So for your homework between now and the next time we see you, I would like you to consider using the notion of the lotus, no mud, no lotus, in your formal practice. So the lotus becomes an image that's an anchor, right? and to maybe start to think about what would my phrases be. And your phrases don't have to be may I. Your phrases it might just be a word. Love, calm, kindness. Maybe choose 3 to 5 to work with, and just make the practice your own. The guided meditation that supports the lesson 7, is a formal practice like the one I just talked you through. So you can lean on that as well. All right, it's probably about 6 or 7 minutes. So that is there for you. And also, there will be a link to Tara Brach's Rain and the way that she'll guide you through that in a really beautiful way as well.
I would definitely recommend giving that a listen at least one time. I come back to it quite often, and I'm studying with Tara right now. She's an amazing teacher. Just with so much richness in her experience.
And I would like to send you something extra, that SCARF, SCARF acronym, and also a link to something I just watched this weekend, which reminded me a great deal of Viktor Frankl's Journey, Man's Search for Meaning. But it's actually an episode of Oprah Soul Series where she interviewed a woman who's 91, Holocaust survivor, who became a trauma therapist, and she still practices. She still sees clients. You will just fall in love with this woman. But she just wrote a book called The Choice. And what happens in that interview is a beautiful summarization of your last 3 lessons, lessons 5, 6, and 7. And again, her entire way of coping through what she lived through was becoming aware as a girl that she had a choice. Yeah. And that revelation occurred when she and her mom and sister were brought into the camp, and you could go right or left, and they didn't realize that right meant meant life, and left meant death. And all of the parents were meant to go left. But mom was really young looking. And so the guard said to Edith, who's in this interview, "Is this your mom or your sister?" And she was so terrified. She said, "Oh, this is my mom." She thought she'd get in trouble for lying. And they said, "Okay." Mom goes left. And she said, "I started to follow my mom." And the guard pulled me away and said, "Oh, your mom is just going to take a shower. You'll see her in about an hour or so." And she and her sister went right. And she never saw her mom again. And lived with this, like, and she knew that if I live with this guilt of having said the wrong thing, this will put an end to my life. But the first thing that happened was she and her sisters had their head shaved. And she said, my older sister looked at me and said, "How do I look?" And she said, "I realized in that moment that I would become my sister's mirror, and that anything that I said back to her would impact how she saw herself and how she felt about herself. So I had a choice, right? A reactive reply would have been, "Oh my God, your beautiful hair, it's gone. What's going to happen to us?" And she said, "I looked at my sister and I said, I never noticed how beautiful your eyes are with all of that care you had. Now I can see your beautiful eyes." And therein was the first choice. And that notion of choice. You can jail me, abuse me, torture me, but you cannot rob me of how I'm going to see things, how I'm going to respond to things. You cannot take that choice from me. So that's just would you like to see the interview? I'll send you the link. It's very, very compelling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mindfulness of mind.
Yes.
Lesson 8 is next.
One of my favorites.
Mhm.
I apologize for the sounds. Like, I'm trying to-